Wednesday, March 10th, 2021, the Max Gottlich Newsletter number 1, There is Nothing New About the U.S. Debt-Based Economy by Max Gottlich. It all started back in 1913. On December 23rd, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed into law the Federal Reserve Act. After that historic day, the U.S. continues to serve monetary policies through a central bank, the Fed. Of course, Congress has the power to amend the act, which they have done quite a few times, most notably after they declared war in 1917 and World War I, because the newly established Fed and the US Treasury decided it was necessary to spend a colossal amount of money or to increase government spending to pay for resources and to financially support allies to the US. Obviously, the federal government needed money, so they resorted to becoming a lender to the banking system, and they sold hundreds of billions of dollars, in today's terms, in war bonds and treasuries by advertising much of what's being advertised today. Cheap money. This cheap money is originated from artificially low interest rates and debt. The combination of the two results in an ultimate increase in the money supply, velocity of money declining, and a levered environment. The fact that the Fed has the power to change the Fed funds rate and increase or decrease the monetary base by buying or selling Treasury securities determines the liquidity factor the Fed enables for the banking system and uninsured depositors. FDIC was established in 1933 under President Franklin Roosevelt. The liquidity factor is satisfied primarily through depository institutions using the Fed funds rate for short-term or overnight lending borrowing, or in relatively recent years through repo or reverse repo transactions. An explosion in total public-private debt. It's important to understand the foundations of central banking, given how many trillions of dollars flow through the currency system. Of course, the bank panic of 1907 led to the establishment of the Fed, and the whole point of the act was to improve the US banking and currency system by improving liquidity and currency elasticity for Fed member banks and depository institutions. The act enabled banks to become jointly liable rather than individually responsible, which helped banks extend credit or loans in a timely manner. The evolution of central banking and monetary policies from its inception to currently has transitioned the US economy from the world's largest creditor nation to the world's largest debtor nation, primarily due to an exponential growth in the national debt supported by artificially low interest rates. The US national debt currently stands at $28.03 trillion. Below is a clear illustration of exponential growth in total public debt. The data goes all the way back to 1966, and it was last updated December 2nd, 2020. In a debt-based economy, much like the US, the debt must be supported with low interest rates, otherwise the interest payments on the debt will be too much to bear. The chart below illustrates an inverse relationship between total public debt and the 10-year Treasury yield. Currently, as you can tell, the divergence between this relationship has never been larger in US history, which means the debt to GDP ratio is extremely high. This puts the US and other countries like Japan and Italy in a troubling position in terms of real economic growth and even default risk. In fact, in Q2 1981, the US had a debt to GDP ratio of 30.7%, and ever since, it's climbed all the way to 135.6% as of Q2 2020. Every year, the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, publishes their long-term budget outlook and projections 30 years into the future, assuming laws are unchanged. They project federal debt held by the public to yield 202% of GDP in 2051, and the deficit is projected to reach 13% of GDP. Is the CBO suggesting Japanification? It seems so, since Japan has been performing monetary policies, QE, for longer than the US, far longer than the US, which has been far from successful and resulted in decades of economic stagflation, and yet the actions of the federal government are a mirror image to the Bank of Japan and the ECB. Japanification. The term Japanification refers to other sovereign nations that are in the same economic stagflation, low inflation, low interest rates, massive debt, and massive government spending, which enables a snowball effect in debt accumulation, which is the equivalent of putting out a fire with gasoline. Some argue there is a quote unquote limit to how much debt a sovereign can have until seriously burdening real economic growth. Systemic risk certainly underlies nations with exploding fiscal deficits accompanied by debt monetization and massive government spending. Obviously, COVID 19 is merely what pricked the quote unquote everything bubble, which, as of the first day of 2021, the federal government spent almost $2 trillion in response to COVID 19. The federal government spent $6.55 trillion just in fiscal year 2020. In fact, federal spending was 44% of GDP for fiscal year 2020, which does not include state and local government spending, while Japan's government spending has been about 40% of GDP for the better part of 20 years. However, there's a significant difference in the rate of change in assets held at Fed banks versus the Bank of Japan, BOJ. As you could tell from the chart below, you could clearly see the rate of change in the amount of assets held by the Fed both in October of the great financial crisis of '08, GFC, and shortly after the pandemic in May 2020 was far greater in both size and speed. Of course, this is a newsletter and not a book, so this may be an appropriate conclusion, although this is just the beginning of a very complex system which evolves through time to become an even more unimaginably complex system. The lesson to be taken here is since the inception of the free market economy, the misunderstood federal government and central banks around the world have abided to their quote unquote proven models and analytical frameworks year after year, decade after decade, which has resulted in a progressive currency devaluation against other currencies and a significant amount of debt and unfunded liabilities that will take the federal government hundreds of years to service. In other words, the federal government is trapped. Thank you.